Morning to all of our attendees. This morning we are looking at liability. Liability, what is it? Well, let's get straight into our toolbox talk for this morning. Liability is the state of being legally responsible for something. Now, in terms of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, every single person is responsible for health and safety. This is from the employer down to the employees. In fact, even visitors to our sites have a certain responsibility. Now, when we talk about liability, there is always somebody that is ultimately liable for something. And when it comes to the OSHAC, that is no different. Our 16.1, or the CEO of the company, is ultimately liable for all health and safety matters within a company. But he delegates responsibility. And this delegation of responsibility comes with certain liability, minor liability, employee liability, but ultimately the employer is still liable for health and safety. However, you can hand over certain responsibilities, and we'll take a look at how that works. We're outlining 3 things that assist all companies with their liability and how you as an employee can benefit and promote this type of good responsibility toward health and safety. Now, first of all, everyone is responsible for health and safety. So please remember, regardless of the appointment that you've been given, regardless of the position that you hold in the company, whether it's a major one or a minor one, it does not take away from your responsibility toward health and safety, not just for yourself, but for any other person that is around you or who may be affected by the work that you perform. The second part of liability, being responsible for something, means that you need to know and understand the risks and precautions. Now, as we'll see later on, the person who's responsible for carrying out a risk assessment or mitigating risk in the company is the employer, and he does this by appointing certain competent, responsible people. But it is also our responsibility as an employee to know and understand the risks and precautions. Now, all too often we find that risk assessments are performed on site. We sign for them on the last page, but have we actually read through them? Have you gone through the step-by-step procedure of how you're performing that task? What are the individual activities that you're going to be performing for that specific scope of work? Have you seen what the identified hazards are? Now, why is this an important thing? For one, it helps you to know what is the source of danger, what could affect you while performing this work. And then with a risk, it will tell you what is the outcome of this source of exposure. So working at heights, you can fall. Working with electricity, you can get electrocuted. But there's so much more to the actual risk assessment that you want to look at. You might point out something that we may have missed. And let's be honest, we have a lot of safety professionals online. We try to cover all bases. But oftentimes we are not actually involved in the scope of work. And as much as we try to be on every site and working with many of you out in the industry to try and design risk assessments tailor-made to the scope of work you're performing, we don't get to every sort of environment that you work in. And so there is a very big possibility for things to be overlooked. And this is where we need your assistance as the employee performing the work. You see, you can pick up things that we might not be able to see. And yes, we've worked along with many plumbers out in the industry doing your major or bulk installation work, working in trenches and excavations, working at heights, your scaffolding and ladders. And all of this assists us in understanding the risk that you are exposed to. But what we really want to see is how you are reacting to this risk. Now, the third thing in terms of being responsible for something is if you are responsible for a scope of work, so you're a responsible plumber, you also need to be competent in that work that you are performing. You see, you're responsible to ensure that you are trained and competent in the work you're doing. Whether you're an appy being trained, which means you're working your way toward competence, but perhaps you're a first aider, or maybe you're a firefighter. Well, you need to be trained and competent in this scope of work as well. Sorry, guys. I see that being muted. I shouldn't have pressed spacebar. Then also to report unsafe acts or conditions. This is a huge responsibility for plumbers. If you find something that could be unsafe, something that may not be covered in the risk assessment, or perhaps something that is over and above the risk assessment. Things like what humans do, horseplay, or perhaps the environment that our company has put us in. Maybe we are working on a site, but the site itself is unsafe to a degree. Or we want to report these unsafe acts or conditions to prevent future risks from happening. Then, should these risks or accidents actually occur, we want to report incidents and accidents as soon as possible to prevent the reoccurrence of these incidents and accidents. And then lastly, cooperate to promote an overall safe working environment. This is a responsibility of each individual within the company. So we're going to look at three things. These are not all encompassing. In other words, we're not putting all the information that you need to know within these three: risk management, incident and emergency management, or appointments and training. We're just giving you basic outlines and showing you how these three things work together in order to ensure your liability is covered, but also perhaps it will outline certain gaps. Maybe there's something that you notice that is not in place in your company and something that could maybe possibly be handled as soon as possible. So let's get straight into these three items. The first thing being risk management. Now, to achieve a safe working environment, we want to ensure that we perform a risk assessment as soon as possible. This must always be done before work is going to occur. So how do we do this? Well, we want to outline the steps of the tasks or activities, including what tools we're using, what equipment we're using. All of this should be outlined in specific steps. Once we've got these steps, and not all inclusive, so we don't want one step installing a geyser. The first step might be unpacking tools. The second thing might be manually carrying these tools to the working environment. So break them up into increments. The step-by-step procedure of how you're performing your task. Then identify and isolate the individual hazards per task or per activity. And there might be additional ones, so you might need more than one document in order to capture all the hazards. And once you've outlined the hazards, you will then see what the consequences are. And this is where you rate your risk. Is it a low, medium, high, or catastrophic risk category? Now, what this means is the job that you're performing, you want to get the raw risk or the initial risk of the actual task. And this will help us to develop mitigating factors. And a mitigating factor is just something that you put in place to make it safer. And then also, before we make it safer, we want to ensure that we are using the most effective means to make it safe. And so we don't want to just resort to PPE. We want to first take a look at what is more effective in mitigating a very big risk. For instance, if you are working in an excavation or in a trench, giving people a hard hat and a safety vest to be seen and boots, in case rocks fall down, these are all good mitigating factors, and it's mandatory to wear PPE within this environment. But if we didn't put shoring in place, we didn't put bracing, we didn't have adequate access, we didn't ensure our 1 to 2 meter rule around our excavation, if we didn't ensure that the ground itself was checked before we put people inside there, all of these mitigating factors, if we leave that aside and just resort to PPE, well, the risk is not lowered. In fact, we're not really mitigating risk at all. All we are doing is waiting for something to happen that could potentially be fatal to that person. And then PPE will not really count. So yes, PPE is good. It has its place. It helps us to stop, small incidents and accidents, bumps and scrapes and scratches, but it doesn't protect us from engulfment when working in such an environment. The only mitigating factor there is proper shoring or adequate bracing for the actual excavation. And so here we can see why it is so important to look for the most effective means first. Again, it comes down to the liability. We are responsible to keep it safe. And then the final thing in our risk management is to constantly monitor and evaluate. Why do we monitor and evaluate? Well, monitoring, first of all, is checking whether the risk assessment is being upheld. Is it being done the way the precautionary measures tell us to do it? And then evaluating, is it effective? Are people getting hurt still, even though our risk assessment outlines the safe precautionary measures? Or are people not getting hurt? Are there minor or insignificant incidents and accidents that are occurring that we can still tweak the risk assessment to a degree to prevent any incident and accident from occurring? And this is really a continuous management that needs to be done in terms of risk. Now, hand in hand with that is your incident and accident or emergency management as well. And this is both a proactive as well as a reactive system of continuous risk management. So, an outline of a company's health and safety is always risk management. That will permeate everything we do. We are constantly trying to manage our risk. And part of that, as we mentioned, is being in an incident or an accident or having an emergency. Now, the first step that we want to take is proactive. So before an incident or accident occurs, we do all we can to prevent it from occurring. These are like our risk assessment, as we mentioned in the beginning, training the individuals that are actually working in these dangerous environments, ensuring there is good, adequate supervision, competent supervision of these employees, making sure we've got our policies and procedures in place on how to adequately stop incidents and accidents from occurring. And then planned action documentation. In other words, before an incident happens, we want to know what should we do if an incident happens. Now, this is both part of a proactive and a reactive approach. The reason why it's proactive is because you're planning for a possibility of an incident, but then the document itself becomes the step-by-step reactive control to that risk. So the reactive is after an incident or after an accident occurs. Now we do everything we can to prevent it from reoccurring. And some of the documents or systems of control you're going to put in place there is your initial response to the incident or accident. This could be like ensuring you have a qualified first aider to respond to an incident or an accident, ensuring you have qualified firefighters to stop a fire from getting out of control, or perhaps you need to evacuate. Now, if we don't have these procedures outlined of how to do each one of these in the proactive approach, then when an incident or accident happens, we are not going to be able to react in that situation. In other words, we won't know what to do if an incident or accident occurs. Then additional things that you will have to do as a reactive approach is investigate after an incident with the purpose or the goal of seeing how it happened, finding out the root cause of where this incident happened or why it happened, and then trying to prevent it from happening in the future. And with all this comes documentation. You need to record all of this information. You need to put it on some sort of reporting, either for our company internally, or you're going to report it to the Department of Labor in order to get some sort of compensation for these injuries that occurred. And then when all of this is done, again, part of your incident accident management comes back down to management of risk. And so if we have incidents or accidents, we need to go and reassess our risk. We need to go and reassess the risk assessment that we performed. Is it effective? And if it was effective, why did this incident or accident occur? Why are my people, my employees, still getting injured? And this, again, comes down to who we've appointed and how adequate our training actually is. Now, to ensure the previous two systems, the system of risk management as well as incident and accident management, needs to be effective and continually monitored. This cannot always be done by the employer himself. It's often his responsibility to run as an operational controller the entire business. Other companies have a CEO plus a COO, a Chief Operations Officer. So somebody who's taking that responsibility and operating the company while the CEO does the overall management. But not all companies are set up in this way. Sometimes it's the owner himself that is inside the trench or inside the excavation, actually performing the work with the employees as well. And so it's very important then to ensure that we delegate responsibility appropriate to the size and type of company we're running. And in the plumbing industry, we want to empower each and every employee specifically in terms of health and safety. And so ensure you have appointed responsible persons who can monitor, supervise, and give instructions in terms of health and safety. And then ensure you've got an established training schedule. Now, let's look at each of these separately. Uh, From an appointment perspective, there are many appointments that the Occupational Health and Safety Act, as well as your regulations, point out. Things that affect you as a plumber out in the industry are things like appointing an OHS Act 16.2. Now, a 16.2 appointment is somebody that takes the responsibility in different areas from the CEO. And the CEO is allowed to delegate certain responsibilities to this person. And it doesn't alleviate him. The CEO is still ultimately responsible and ultimately liable for the health and safety. But what this does is it empowers someone else in a position of authority in order to assist the CEO with risk management, with incident and accident management, with the overall health and safety of a company. Now, working within a company, an office, you have different management positions as well. This would be under the 16.2. So 16.2, we could say, is the 2IC to the CEO. Now you can have different levels of management, like a 8.2E, this could be an office manager, or an 8.2I, a workshop manager, somebody who's supervising plant and machinery. Now, if you appoint these people, let's take, for instance, an 8.2I appointment. This is someone who should be supervising employees who are using tools and plant and equipment. Now, if this supervisor doesn't understand the risks and hazards associated with those tools and plant, how can he adequately supervise that person? And so ensure that when we just do an appointment, don't just randomly select any person. Even if we think that person is capable, we want to ensure that they're capable. Why? Because they will be liable. It comes back to your liability as a company, as an employer, and the liability and responsibility of each employee. For many of you in the plumbing industry, you're working in construction. And so perhaps you have to be a principal contractor on site, and you appoint an 8.1, a construction site manager. Then you will get an assistant manager as an 8.2. Perhaps you even need an 8.7, a construction supervisor for various areas within that site. All these appointments must be documented. You must outline the specific scope of authority within that. But again, it comes with training. Are they competent to perform those specific tasks? Your GSR 3.4, that's your first aider. Every company with more than 10 employees must have a qualified first aider. Is this person appointed? But also, have they been trained? Now, training can come in many forms. A lot of training can also be done in-house. So we train our staff on stacking and storing of our tools and equipment on site. We train them on housekeeping. But the regulations within South Africa states that if there are regulations from SAQA, the South African Qualifications Authority, governing a specific training, then these must be utilized. So you might have to send employees for specific training. And these could be things like operator training. If you're operating a forklift, well, you can't do this in-house. You're not allowed to do it in-house because there is a SAQA governed aligned unit standard in order to train that. And the same goes for first aid. You can't just train in-house first aiders. You have to send them to a qualified service provider in order to get this training. And so to recap, risk management in an entire company should be everyone's liability. Yes, the CEO or the employer is ultimately liable, but each one of us are responsible to ensure a safe working environment for ourselves, for those around us, or any other person that may be affected by the work we perform. So this brings us to the end of our Toolbox talk for this morning, and we would like to say thank you very much for joining us this morning.